Starving dog leads rescuers to orphan baby. What follows will amaze you. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The storm had passed days ago, but its aftermath lingered. Broken tree limbs and scattered debris littered the once picturesque countryside, leaving the small town of Willow Creek in a state of quiet recovery. People worked tirelessly to rebuild their homes and salvage what they could, but amidst the chaos, another group struggled silently: the animals. Shadow, as the townsfolk had come to call him, was a stray dog with a wiry frame and eyes that spoke of hardships endured. He had appeared in the town months ago, scavenging for scraps near the marketplace and sleeping under an abandoned shed by the river. No one knew where he had come from, but Shadow had a way of disappearing and reappearing like a ghost, earning him his name. Now, the storm had made survival even harder. Food was scarce, and Shadow's thin ribs pressed against his matted fur as he wandered through the woods. His sharp nose searched desperately for any scent of food, but what he found instead stopped him in his tracks. A faint cry. Shadow's ears perked up, his head tilting as he listened. It wasn't the cry of another dog or even a wild animal. It was softer, weaker, and distinctly different. Intrigued and driven by something deeper than hunger, Shadow began to follow the sound, his paws crunching softly against the damp underbrush. The cries grew louder as he approached a cluster of bushes near a fallen tree. Shadow sniffed the air cautiously before poking his head through the foliage. What he saw made him freeze. There, nestled among the leaves, was a tiny baby. Its face was red and scrunched, tears streaming down its cheeks as it wailed weakly. The baby's small body was wrapped in a tattered blanket, damp from the morning dew. Shadow sniffed the baby cautiously, his warm breath causing it to stir. The cries softened, and the baby's wide, tear-filled eyes met Shadow's. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Shadow's protective instincts kicked in almost immediately. He nosed the baby gently, as if checking for injuries, before circling it protectively. The storm had left the woods dangerous, with predators on the prowl and debris making every step treacherous. Shadow knew he couldn't leave the baby here. It wouldn't survive. The cries resumed, louder this time, echoing through the stillness of the woods. Shadow barked sharply, his voice carrying through the trees like a signal flare. He barked again and again, hoping someone, anyone, would hear. Shadow's barking echoed through the woods, sharp and urgent, cutting through the eerie silence left by the storm. He paced around the baby, his movements restless and protective, his ears twitching at every rustle of leaves. The baby's cries grew weaker, and Shadow nudged the tiny bundle with his nose, as if to coax it back to life. He didn't understand much, but he understood this. The baby needed help and fast. Minutes felt like hours as Shadow continued his vigil. Then a distant sound, footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Shadow's ears perked up, his barking intensifying as he ran toward the noise, only to stop and dart back to the baby, as if urging the unseen intruders to follow him. "Do you hear that?" A woman's voice called out, cutting through the quiet. "Yeah, it's a dog," another voice replied, this one deeper and gruff. "And it sounds like it's in trouble." Through the dense foliage, two figures emerged, a man and a woman in their late 40s, both wearing the green uniforms of the local wildlife rescue team. The woman, Sarah, carried a medical kit slung over her shoulder, while the man, Tom, gripped a walking stick. Both stopped short when they saw Shadow, his wiry frame blocking their path. "Well, there's your dog," Tom said, raising an eyebrow. "But what's he?" Shadow barked again, cutting him off, and then turned sharply, running back toward the bushes where the baby lay. He stopped, looking back at the humans with an urgent whine, his tail wagging frantically as if to say, "Follow me." "Wait, is he trying to lead us somewhere?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowed. "Looks like it," Tom replied, stepping forward cautiously. "Let's see what this is about." Shadow led them straight to the baby, his barks growing softer as he crouched protectively near the tiny bundle. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she knelt beside the baby. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's a baby." Tom crouched beside her, his face a mix of shock and concern. "How did it end up here?" he muttered, shaking his head. "This storm must have. I don't even want to think about it." Sarah carefully unwrapped the damp blanket, checking the baby for injuries. "She's cold and dehydrated," she said, her voice steady despite the urgency in her movements. "But she's alive. We need to get her to the shelter now." Shadow whined softly, his eyes fixed on the baby as Sarah bundled her up and cradled her close. Tom glanced at the dog, his expression softening. "You found her, didn't you, boy?" he said. "You saved her." Shadow wagged his tail faintly, but his gaze didn't leave the baby. Even as the rescuers began to move, he stayed close, his body tense and his ears alert. "Looks like we've got an extra passenger," Sarah said, smiling faintly. "Let's go." The drive back to the Wildlife Rescue Center was tense but hopeful. Sarah sat in the back seat of the truck, holding the baby close to her chest, while Tom navigated the muddy roads. Shadow sat on the floor, his head resting on Sarah's knee, his eyes darting between her and the baby. "You're a good boy," Sarah murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "Don't worry. We'll take care of her." When they arrived at the center, the team sprang into action. The baby was taken to a quiet room where Sarah and another rescuer worked quickly to stabilize her. Shadow followed them inside, his nails clicking against the tile floor as he paced near the doorway. "Easy boy," Tom said, kneeling beside the dog. "They've got it under control." But Shadow wasn't convinced. He stayed by the door, his ears perked and his body tense, as if ready to spring into action at any moment. Tom sighed, reaching out to scratch the dog's head. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" Shadow's eyes met Tom's, and in that moment, the man felt a surge of admiration for the scrappy stray. "All right," he said. "You can stay. But you'd better behave." The baby's condition gradually improved over the next few days, thanks to the care and dedication of the rescue team. She was given fluids, wrapped in warm blankets, and watched over around the clock. Shadow became an unofficial part of the team, never straying far from the baby's side. At first, the other rescuers were skeptical about having a stray dog in such close proximity to a vulnerable infant, but Shadow's behavior quickly won them over. He was calm, attentive, and protective, often alerting the team when the baby stirred or cried. "It's like he's her guardian angel," Sarah said one afternoon, watching as Shadow lay beside the baby's crib, his head resting on his paws. Tom nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "I've seen a lot of animals in my time, but I've never seen anything like this. He's special, that's for sure." As the days turned into weeks, Shadow's bond with the baby deepened. He seemed to sense her every need, nudging Sarah or Tom whenever something was wrong. The baby, in turn, responded to Shadow's presence with coos and smiles, her tiny hands reaching out to touch his fur. "She's getting stronger," Sarah said one evening, cradling the baby in her arms. "And I think Shadow has a lot to do with that." Tom chuckled, glancing at the dog. "He's a hero, no doubt about it. But he's also a mystery. Where did he come from? And why did he care so much about this baby?" Sarah shrugged, her gaze soft. Maybe he saw something in her that reminded him of himself. Lost, scared, and needing someone to care. One morning, as the team was preparing for another busy day at the center, Shadow began barking excitedly near the entrance. Tom hurried over, his brow furrowing. "What's going on, boy?" he asked. Shadow darted to the door, barking and wagging his tail, then ran back to Tom, his movements urgent. "You've got that look again," Tom muttered, grabbing his jacket. "All right, lead the way." Shadow led Tom through the woods surrounding the center, his nose to the ground and his tail held high. The man followed closely, his curiosity growing with each step. Finally, they reached a small clearing where Shadow stopped, barking sharply. Tom's eyes widened as he spotted another box tucked beneath a cluster of bushes. Inside, he found 3 tiny, shivering puppies, their eyes barely open. "Well, I'll be," Tom muttered, his voice tinged with awe. "You did it again, boy." Shadow sniffed the puppies carefully before lying down beside them, his body language protective yet gentle. Tom couldn't help but smile. "You're not just a hero, you're a guardian." Shadow's actions inspire the entire team, reminding them of the incredible capacity for compassion and connection that animals possessed. As the puppies were brought back to the center and cared for, Shadow remained a constant presence, his loyalty and dedication unwavering. The baby, now healthy and thriving, continued to light up the room with her laughter, her bond with Shadow stronger than ever. And as word of Shadow's heroism spread through the town, he became a symbol of hope and resilience for a community still recovering from the storm. Shadow's fame spread quickly through Willow Creek, and soon the entire town knew of the scrappy stray who had saved a baby and uncovered abandoned puppies. His story became a beacon of hope, reminding everyone of the strength and compassion that could arise even in the face of hardship. Shadow, however, seemed oblivious to the attention. For him, the world revolved around the baby and the puppies he had rescued, and he remained steadfast in his role as their protector. At the Wildlife Rescue Center, Shadow had become more than just a stray. He was family. The baby, whom the staff had begun calling Lily, grew stronger with each passing day. Her laughter filled the halls, a sound so pure and joyful that even the most exhausted rescuers found themselves smiling. Shadow was always by her side, his tail wagging whenever she reached out to touch his fur. The puppies, too, were thriving under the care of the team. Though they were still small and vulnerable, they had begun to explore their surroundings, their tiny tails wagging with curiosity. Shadow watched over them like a proud parent, nudging them back towards safety whenever they ventured too far. One afternoon, as Sarah sat on the floor with Lily in her lap, Shadow curled up beside them, his eyes half closed. Tom entered the room, a clipboard in hand and a grin on his face. "Guess what?" he said, his tone cheerful. Sarah looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What?" "We've been contacted by a local news station. They want to do a story on Shadow and everything he's done," Tom replied, sitting down on a nearby chair. "They think it could help raise awareness for the center and maybe even bring in some donations." Sarah smiled, glancing at Shadow. "Well, if anyone deserves the spotlight, it's him. He's been nothing short of amazing." Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of his name, and he lifted his head, looking at Sarah with a curious expression. She laughed, scratching behind his ears. "That's right, you're going to be famous." The news crew arrived the following week, their cameras and equipment drawing curious glances from the staff and animals alike. Shadow seemed unbothered by the commotion, sitting calmly as Sarah and Tom recounted his heroic deeds. The crew filmed him interacting with Lily and the puppies, capturing moments that were as heartwarming as they were extraordinary. "Shadow's story is unlike anything we've ever seen," the reporter said during an interview with Sarah. "He's not just a stray, he's a hero. What do you think drives him to act the way he does?" Sarah thought for a moment, her gaze softening as she looked at Shadow. "I think Shadow understands what it's like to be lost and alone," she said. "And because of that, he's made it his mission to help others, whether they're human or animal." The segment aired later that evening, and the response was overwhelming. Donations poured into the center, along with messages of support and gratitude from viewers across the country. Shadow became a local celebrity, his story inspiring people far beyond the borders of Willow Creek. But Shadow wasn't done making an impact. A few weeks after the news segment aired, the rescue team received a call about a dog who had been spotted near an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The caller reported hearing faint cries coming from the area, but they hadn't been able to investigate further. Tom and Sarah decided to check it out, bringing Shadow along for the journey. The dog, who seemed to sense the urgency of the situation, stayed close to their side as they approached the crumbling structure. The building was eerily silent, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. Shadow sniffed the air, his body tense as he moved toward the entrance. Tom and Sarah followed, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, the cries grew louder, a sound so faint and desperate that it sent shivers down their spines. Shadow led the way, his nose to the ground as he navigated the debris-strewn floor. Finally, they reached a small room at the back of the building, where a cardboard box sat tucked in the corner. Sarah knelt down, her breath catching as she lifted the lid. Inside were two tiny kittens, their fur matted and their eyes wide with fear. "Oh, you poor things," she murmured, carefully scooping them up. Tom shook his head, his expression a mix of sadness and admiration. "Shadow, you've done it again," he said, glancing at the dog. "You really are something else." Shadow wagged his tail, his gaze fixed on the kittens as if to make sure they were safe. Sarah cradled them gently, her heart aching for the tiny creatures who had been abandoned and left to fend for themselves. "We'll take them back to the center," she said, her voice firm, "and we'll make sure they get the care they need." The kittens, like the puppies before them, thrived under the care of the rescue team. Shadow, true to form, took on the role of guardian once again, watching over them with a quiet devotion that melted everyone's hearts. It was clear to anyone who met him that Shadow's capacity for love and compassion knew no bounds. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in her office, she glanced at a photo on her desk. It was a picture of Shadow sitting beside Lily, his eyes filled with the quiet wisdom that had made him so special. Sarah smiled, feeling a swell of gratitude for the dog who had changed so many lives, including her own. Shadow, as always, was more than a hero. He was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, kindness could light the way. Shadow's story continued to unfold in ways no one could have anticipated. The rescue center thrived, thanks in large part to the attention he had brought to their work. Donations continued to pour in, allowing them to expand their facilities and rescue even more animals in need. Shadow remained at the heart of it all, his quiet presence a constant source of inspiration for the staff, volunteers, and visitors. One chilly morning, Sarah arrived at the center to find Shadow waiting by the front gate. His tail wagged slowly, but his posture was alert. His ears perked as if he were anticipating something. "What's up, boy?" Sarah asked, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. Shadow nuzzled her hand before turning his gaze toward the horizon, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Sarah frowned, following his line of sight. The road leading to the center was empty, but the way Shadow stood, tense and focused, told her something was coming. "All right," she said, standing up. "Let's see what you're so worked up about." An hour later, a small van pulled into the driveway, its exterior marked with the logo of a neighboring animal shelter. A woman stepped out, her expression weary but determined. Sarah recognized her immediately, Megan, the director of the shelter that had partnered with them on numerous rescues. "Megan," Sarah greeted her warmly. "What brings you here?" Megan sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We've got a situation," she said, her tone serious. "There's been an incident at a construction site on the outskirts of town. A mother dog and her litter were spotted there, but the workers scared her off. We managed to find the puppies, but the mother is still out there, and we're stretched too thin to look for her." Shadow, who had been sitting quietly beside Sarah, let out a soft whine. Megan glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "Is this the famous Shadow?" Sarah nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "He's been our guardian angel around here. If anyone can help us, it's him." Megan hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's see what he can do." The rescue team set out later that afternoon, with Shadow leading the way. The construction site was a chaotic maze of machinery, debris, and half-finished structures, the noise from the equipment creating a constant hum. Shadow sniffed the air, his movements deliberate as he began to search for the mother dog scent. Tom, who had joined the team for the mission, watched Shadow with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "How does he do it?" he asked. "It's like he knows exactly what to look for." Sarah shrugged, her gaze fixed on Shadow. "He's got instincts we'll never fully understand. But one thing's for sure, he doesn't give up." Shadow suddenly froze, his ears twitching. He let out a low bark, then darted toward a pile of rubble near the edge of the site. Sarah and Tom followed, their boots crunching against the gravel. Beneath the rubble, a faint whimper could be heard. Shadow began to dig, his paws kicking up dust and small rocks as he worked to uncover the source of the sound. Sarah knelt beside him, helping to clear the debris. Within moments, a small trembling figure emerged, a skinny, dirt-covered dog with wide, frightened eyes. "There you are," Sarah murmured, her voice soft as she reached out to the dog. The mother dog hesitated, her body trembling, but Shadow stepped forward, his posture calm and reassuring. He let out a soft whine, and the mother dog seemed to relax, allowing Sarah to scoop her up. Tom smiled, shaking his head. "He's a miracle worker, that one." Back at the center, the mother dog was reunited with her puppies, her tail wagging faintly as she sniffed each of them in turn. Shadow watched from a distance, his tail swishing as if in approval. Sarah sat beside him, resting a hand on his back. "You did it again," she said, her voice filled with pride. "I don't know how we do this without you." Shadow leaned into her touch, his eyes half closing as if to say, "It's all in a day's work." As the months went by, Shadow's legend continued to grow. He had become a local hero, a symbol of hope and resilience for the entire community. Families who had adopted animals from the center often returned to visit, bringing treats for Shadow and sharing stories of how their lives had been changed by the animals he helped rescue. One day, a young girl named Emily arrived at the center with her parents. She carried a small hand-drawn card in her hands, which she shyly presented to Sarah. The card featured a crayon drawing of Shadow with the words, "Thank you for saving the animals," written in bright, colorful letters. "This is beautiful," Sarah said, smiling at Emily. "Shadow's going to love it." Emily's face lit up as Sarah led her to the yard where Shadow was resting. The dog lifted his head as they approached, his tail wagging at the sight of the little girl. "Hi, Shadow," Emily said softly, holding out the card. "This is for you." Shadow sniffed the card, then gently licked Emily's hand, causing her to giggle. Sarah watched the interaction, her heart swelling with gratitude for the dog who had brought so much light into their lives. One evening, as the sun set over the rolling hills of Willow Creek, Sarah sat on the porch of the rescue center, a cup of tea in her hands. Shadow lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws as he watched the horizon. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" Sarah said softly, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "From a scrappy stray to the heart of this place." Shadow looked up at her, his amber eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude for the dog who had changed so many lives, including her own. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Shadow let out a contented sigh, his tail wagging faintly. He didn't need words to express what he felt. He had found his purpose, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone around him of the power of kindness, resilience, and love. As the seasons changed and life continued at the rescue center, Shadow remained at the heart of every story. His presence was a constant source of comfort and joy for the staff, the animals, and the visitors who came to see him. Shadow's quiet heroism had become the foundation upon which the center thrived, and his actions continued to inspire everyone around him. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah stood in the yard, watching a Shadow play with a group of newly rescued puppies. Their small, clumsy movements brought a smile to her face, but her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a car pulling into the driveway. She turned to see a man stepping out, his expression both curious and nervous. "Hi there," the man said, approaching Sarah. "I'm looking for Shadow." Sarah tilted her head, intrigued. "You've come to the right place." "He's over there," she said, pointing toward the yard. The man's face softened as he spotted Shadow, who was busy nudging one of the puppies toward a toy. "I saw the news story about him," the man explained. "And I think he might be my dog." Sarah's eyes widened. "Your dog?" The man nodded, his gaze fixed on Shadow. "His name was Max back when I had him. We lived on a farm not too far from here, but when the storm hit last year, he got spooked and ran off. I searched everywhere, but I couldn't find him. I never stopped hoping he was okay." Shadow, as if sensing he was the subject of the conversation, lifted his head and trotted toward the man. His amber eyes were curious but calm, his movements measured as he approached. The man knelt down, holding out a hand. "Max," he said softly. "It's me. It's James." Shadow stopped a few feet away, sniffing the air cautiously. His ears twitched, and for a moment he stood perfectly still. Then, as if a switch had flipped, his tail began to wag. He took a few steps closer, sniffing James's hand before leaning into him, his body relaxing. "It's him," James said, his voice breaking. "It's really him." Sarah watched the reunion, her heart swelling with emotion. Shadow, or Max, as James had called him, seemed to recognize the man, his tail wagging furiously as James wrapped his arms around him. "I can't believe this," James said, looking up at Sarah with tears in his eyes. Thank you. Thank you for taking care of him." The discovery that Shadow had a previous owner stirred mixed emotions among the staff at the rescue center. They had grown so attached to him, and the thought of saying goodbye was bittersweet. But they also knew that reuniting him with his original family was the right thing to do. Over the next few days, James visited the center frequently, spending hours with Shadow and sharing stories about their life together on the farm. He talked about how Max had always been a protector, looking after the other animals and even helping herd sheep. It became clear to everyone that Shadow's heroism was deeply ingrained in who he was. "Sounds like he was always destined to be a guardian," Sarah said one afternoon as she listened to James recount a story about Max saving a lamb stuck in a fence. James chuckled, scratching Shadow behind the ears. "Yeah, he's always had a big heart. Losing him was one of the hardest things I've ever been through. I never thought I'd see him again." When the day came for Shadow to return to the farm with James, the staff gathered to say their goodbyes. Sarah knelt beside him, her eyes glistening with tears as she stroked his fur. "You've been our rock, Shadow," she said softly. "We want to miss you more than you know. But I'm so happy you found your way back home." Tom, standing nearby, nodded. "You're one of a kind, boy. Don't forget about us." Shadow, as if understanding the gravity of the moment, nuzzled against Sarah and Tom, his tail wagging gently. He then trotted over to the puppies and kittens, giving each of them a final nudge as if to say goodbye. James watched the scene with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "He's made such a difference here," he said. "I promise I'll take good care of him." "We know you will," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. As James's car pulled away, Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his head poking out of the window. He barked once, a sound that echoed through the yard, as if to say goodbye. The staff waved until the car disappeared down the road, the air heavy with a sense of loss but also a deep sense of fulfillment. For the first time in months, the yard felt quiet, almost empty. Sarah stood in the center, her arms crossed as she stared at the road. "He'll be okay," she said, more to herself than anyone else. Tom placed a hand on her shoulder. "He's a survivor, and so are we." Shadow's legacy is going to live on in everything we do here. Life at the rescue center slowly returned to normal, though Shadow's absence was deeply felt by everyone. The animals he helped rescue continued to thrive, and the staff found solace in knowing they were carrying on his work. Shadow had left behind more than just memories. He had left a legacy of kindness, courage, and hope. Months later, Sarah received a letter in the mail. It was from James, accompanied by a photo of Shadow sitting on the porch of the farm, surrounded by sheep and a few new rescue animals. "Dear Sarah and everyone at the rescue center," the letter began. "I wanted to let you know that Max Shadow is doing great. He settled back into life on the farm like he never left, and he's already back to his old ways, watching over everyone and keeping us all in line. I can't thank you enough for everything you did for him. You gave him a second chance, and I'll never forget that. You're always welcome to visit, and I know Max would love to see you. With gratitude, James." Sarah held the letter close, a smile spreading across her face. She showed it to the rest of the staff, who all shared in the joy of knowing that Shadow was thriving. "He's where he's meant to be," Sarah said, her voice warm. "But he'll always be a part of this place, no matter where he is." And so Shadow's story came full circle. He had come into their lives as a stray, a mystery with a heart of gold. He had saved lives, inspired a community, and left an indelible mark on everyone he met. Though he had returned to his original home, his spirit continued to guide the rescue center, reminding them all of the power of love, loyalty, and second chances. Shadow was more than a dog. He was a hero, a guardian, and a symbol of hope, a legacy that would live on forever. The months after Shadow returned to James's farm were both reflective and transformative for the rescue center. Without Shadow's steady presence, the team found themselves drawing inspiration for his legacy in new ways. They worked harder to uphold the lessons Shadow had taught them: compassion, resilience, and the belief that even the smallest act of kindness could spark extraordinary change. The rescue center had grown in scope, thanks to the attention Shadow's story had brought. New facilities were built, more animals were saved, and the community became deeply invested in the center's mission. Volunteers arrived in greater numbers, many of them inspired by Shadow's tale. Children came with their families, eager to meet the animals and learn about how they could make a difference. Yet, no matter how busy the center became, there was a quiet spot in the yard, a patch of grass near the old oak tree, where Shadow used to rest. It had become a symbolic space for the staff, a reminder of the dog who had changed everything. One warm spring morning, as Sarah walked through the yard, she noticed a small group of children sitting by the oak tree. One of the volunteers was telling them Shadow's story, her voice animated as she described his heroic rescues. "And that's when Shadow found the baby in the woods," the volunteer said, her tone filled with wonder. "He didn't just save her, he stayed with her until help arrived. He knew she needed him, and he didn't give up." The children listened intently, their eyes wide with awe. One of them raised a hand. "Do you think Shadow is still helping people?" the child asked. As the weeks went on, the center became a hub of activity and hope. Families came to visit, drawn by Shadow's story and the chance to meet the animals he had helped rescue. Many of them left with new furry companions, their lives forever changed by the bond they had formed. Shadow, meanwhile, seemed content with his place at the center. He had found a family, a community that cherished him for who he was. And while his days of wandering the streets were behind him, his spirit of adventure and determination remained as strong as ever. One evening, as the sun set over the rolling hills of Willow Creek, Sarah sat on the porch of the rescue center, a cup of tea in her hands. Shadow lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws as he watched the horizon. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" Sarah said softly, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "From a scrappy stray to the heart of this place." Shadow looked up at her, his amber eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude for the dog who had changed so many lives, including her own. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Shadow let out a contented sigh, his tail wagging faintly. He didn't need words to express what he felt. He had found his purpose, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone around him of the power of kindness, resilience, and love. Shadow's role at the rescue center continued to grow as the weeks turned into months. He was no longer just a stray dog who had wandered into the lives of the rescuers. He had become the heart of the center, a symbol of hope and resilience. His story had touched so many lives, inspiring not only the staff but also the visitors who came to meet him and the animals he had helped save. One crisp morning, Sarah walked into the center's main yard, where Shadow was lying in the grass, surrounded by the now thriving puppies and kittens. The animals had formed their own little pack, following Shadow's lead and mimicking his behavior. Sarah couldn't help but smile at the sight. "You've got quite the fan club, don't you?" she said, crouching down to scratch Shadow behind his ears. Shadow wagged his tail, his eyes twinkling with affection. One of the kittens pounced playfully on his tail, and he responded with a gentle nudge, his patience seemingly endless. Tom joined Sarah, carrying a clipboard. "You know, I was thinking," he said, glancing at Shadow. "What if we made Shadow the official mascot of the rescue center?" Sarah laughed. "He's already the unofficial mascot, but I like the idea. We could even host an event to celebrate him, something that brings the community together." Tom nodded. "A Shadow Appreciation Day. It could help raise funds for the center and bring attention to all the good work we're doing here." The idea quickly gained momentum, and within days, plans for the event were underway. Flyers were distributed throughout Willow Creek, inviting families to come and meet Shadow, hear his incredible story, and support the rescue center. Local businesses donated supplies and prizes, and volunteers pitched in to help set up booths and activities. When the day of the event arrived, the center buzzed with excitement. Families poured in, their children eager to meet the famous dog they had seen on TV. Shadow greeted each visitor with his usual calm and friendly demeanor, his tail wagging as he soaked up the attention. One of the highlights of the event was a storytelling session where Sarah recounted Shadow's journey, from the moment he found the abandoned baby in the woods to his rescue of the puppies and kittens. As she spoke, Shadow sat beside her, his head resting on her knee, as if he were listening to the story himself. And through it all, Sarah concluded, her voice filled with emotion, "Shadow has shown us what it means to be brave, kind, and selfless. He's not just a hero, he's a reminder that even the smallest acts of love can make a big difference." The crowd erupted into applause, and Shadow lifted his head, his ears perking up as if he understood the praise. Sarah smiled, patting his head. "You deserve every bit of this," she whispered. As the event continued, families visited the adoption booths, where they met the animals that Shadow had helped rescue. Many of them found new homes that day, their lives forever changed by the bond they formed with their furry companions. It was a sight that filled the staff with joy and reinforced their commitment to the center's mission. Shadow, meanwhile, seemed to take everything in stride. He wandered among the visitors, stopping to greet each one and even posing for photos with the children. His gentle nature and quiet strength had a way of putting everyone at ease, making him the perfect ambassador for the center. That evening, as the last of the visitors left and the staff began to clean up, Sarah and Tom sat on the porch, watching Shadow as he lay in the yard, surrounded by the animals he had saved. "Today was a success," Tom said, leaning back in his chair. "We raised more money than we ever expected, and so many animals found homes. Shadow really is the heart of this place." Sarah nodded, her gaze soft. "He's more than that. He's a reminder of why we do what we do. Every life matters, and every act of kindness makes a difference." As the stars appeared in the sky, Shadow let out a contented sigh, his body relaxing against the cool grass. Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Shadow's journey had brought so much light into their lives, and she knew that as long as he was around, the rescue center would continue to thrive. But Shadow's story wasn't over yet. A few days after the event, a man arrived at the center, his expression cautious but hopeful. He introduced himself as Mark, a truck driver who had seen Shadow's story on the news and felt compelled to visit. "I think I might know where Shadow came from," Mark said, his voice tinged with emotion. Sarah and Tom exchanged surprised glances. "Really?" Sarah asked. "Tell us more." Mark explained that a year ago, he had been driving through a nearby town when he saw a dog that looked just like Shadow wandering near a gas station. The dog had a red collar, but no tags, and when Mark tried to approach it, the dog bolted into the woods. I always wondered what happened to him, Mark said. When I saw his picture on TV, I thought, that has to be the same dog. I don't know if he's got an owner out there somewhere, but I had to come and see him for myself. Shadow, who had been lying quietly nearby, lifted his head at the sound of Mark's voice. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to place the man. Do you think Shadow remembers him? Tom asked, watching the dog's reaction. Sarah shrugged. It's hard to say, but Shadow's here now, and he's part of our family. That's what matters. Mark nodded, a faint smile on his lips. You're right. He's found his place here, and it's clear he's happy. Shadow's mysterious past only added to his legend, but it didn't change the life he had built at the rescue center. He continued to be a source of inspiration, his unwavering loyalty and compassion touching everyone who crossed his path. Sarah, who had been listening from a distance, stepped closer. I think so, she said, kneeling beside the group. Shadow has a way of bringing out the best in everyone he meets. Even though he's back at his farm, the kindness he taught us is still making a difference here, and in all of you. The children nodded, their faces thoughtful. One of them, a boy with a shy smile, said, I want to be like Shadow. I want to help animals, too. Sarah's heart swelled with pride. You already are, she said, her voice gentle. Every time you show kindness to an animal or help someone in need, you're carrying on Shadow's legacy. Weeks later, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from James. His voice was warm and filled with excitement. I've got a surprise for you, he said. Do you have time to come to the farm? Curious, Sarah agreed. She arrived at the farm the next day, greeted by the sight of James and Shadow waiting by the gate. Shadow's tail wagged furiously as Sarah stepped out of her car, and she knelt down to greet him. Hi, boy, she said, laughing as Shadow nuzzled her hand. You look as happy as ever. James chuckled. He's been doing great, but there's something I wanted to show you. He led Sarah around the side of the farmhouse, where a small enclosure had been set up. Inside were two young lambs, their tiny tails wagging as they frolicked in the grass. Shadow stood at the edge of the enclosure, watching them with his usual calm and protective demeanor. They were abandoned by their mother, James explained. Max, Shadow, found them out in the pasture and brought us to them. He's been looking after them ever since. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she watched Shadow nudge one of the lambs gently, his patience and care evident in every movement. He never stops, does he? She said softly. James shook his head, proud smile on his face. No, he doesn't. He's still the same dog who saved that baby and those puppies. It's just who he is. As Sarah spent the afternoon at the farm, she couldn't help but marvel at how Shadow's story had come full circle. He had returned to the life he once knew, but he hadn't forgotten the lessons of his time at the rescue center. His actions were a testament to the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, a reminder that kindness could transcend any boundary. Before Sarah left, James handed her a small envelope. I thought you might like this, he said. Inside was a photo of Shadow lying in the grass, the lambs curled up beside him. Written on the back were the words, once a guardian, always a guardian. Sarah smiled, her heart full. Thank you, she said. This means so much. As she drove back to the rescue center, the photo resting on the passenger seat, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Shadow's legacy wasn't just about the lives he had saved. It was about the hope he had inspired and the way he had brought people together. Back at the center, Sarah gathered the staff and volunteers for a meeting. She shared the photo with them, recounting her visit to the farm and Shadow's continued heroism. The room was filled with smiles and nods of agreement as she spoke. Shadow may not be here with us anymore, Sarah said, her voice steady. But his spirit is. And it's up to us to keep that spirit alive. Every animal we save, every act of kindness we show, it's all part of the legacy he left behind. Tom, who had been sitting in the back, raised his hand. How about we create something permanent, he suggested. A memorial for Shadow. Something that reminds us, and everyone who comes here, of what he stood for. The idea was met with enthusiastic agreement, and plans for the memorial quickly took shape. The team decided to place it under the oak tree, where Shadow had spent so many peaceful moments. A local artist volunteered to create a sculpture, capturing Shadow's likeness in a way that would honor his legacy. Months later, the memorial was unveiled in a heartfelt ceremony attended by staff, volunteers, and members of the community. The sculpture depicted Shadow sitting proudly, his gaze calm and steady, as though he were still watching over the center. At the base of the sculpture was a plaque that read, "In loving memory of Shadow, a guardian, a hero, a friend. May his legacy of kindness and courage inspire us all." As the crowd gathered around the memorial, Sarah stepped forward to say a few words. "Shadow taught us that every life matters," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "He showed us that even in the darkest moments, love and compassion can light the way." This memorial isn't just for him. It's for all the animals and people whose lives he touched. And it's a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference. The crowd erupted into applause, their faces shining with gratitude and hope. Sarah looked up at the sculpture, her heart swelling with pride and love for the dog who had brought them all together. Though Shadow no longer roamed the center's grounds, his presence was felt in every corner of the place he had called home. The oak tree became a gathering spot for visitors and staff alike, a place where stories were shared and memories were cherished. And as the rescue center continued its work, saving lives and building bonds, Shadow's legacy lived on, proof that one dog's kindness could change the world.